Lesson 43, Segregation in the Post-War World War II period. Lesson 43, Segregation in the Post-World War II period. Lesson 43, Segregation in the Post-World War II period. How did segregation affect American life in the post-war period? Introduction. Melba Patillo had wanted to ride the merry-go-round at Fair Park in her hometown of Little Rock, Arkansas, for as long as she could remember. But whenever she asked her mother or grandmother to take her, they said it was not possible. So one day, when Melba was 5, she decided to ride on her own. Melba and her family were at Fair Park for a 4th of July picnic when the grown-ups were setting up tables for food. Melba escaped to the merry-go-round, recalling, I had my eye on one horse in particular, Prancer, the one I had dreamed about during all those months. I saved up the 5 pennies I needed to ride him. When Melba tried to give her money to the man working the ride, he responded coldly, "There's no space for you here." She remarked that Prancer's saddle was empty, and the man grew enraged, banged the counter so hard the pennies fell off. "You don't belong here," he yelled. Melba's knees shook. She saw others angrily glaring at her like she had done something wrong and promptly ran back to her family. "I was so terrified," she said, "that I didn't even have time to take and pick up my precious pennies. At 5, I learned that there was to be no space for me on that merry-go-round, no matter how many saddles stood empty." Melba Patillo was a black child in the segregated South. During her childhood in the 1940s, African Americans throughout the South suffered under a harsh system of racial discrimination. Jim Crow segregation laws not only kept blacks out of amusement parks like Fair Park, but also separated blacks from whites in most public facilities, including schools, libraries, and hospitals. In this lesson, you will glimpse post-war life for African Americans both in the South and the rest of the country. You will also learn how their lives finally began to change for the better during this period. A nation divided, segregation in American life. Racial segregation forced blacks to behave in certain ways. First, they were expected to accept and comply with a lesser status in society, a pattern behavior that W.E.B. Du Bois dubbed living behind the veil. They acted normally in private or among other blacks, but put on a mask that hid their true feelings around whites, so they would appear meek and inferior. In practice, most black people avoided looking white people in the eye and would look at the ground when speaking to them. In many states, a black man could not look directly at a white woman or touch her accidentally, as he might face a lynch mob if charged with inappropriate attention to white women. Blacks had to accept white insults and degrading names such as boy, girl, auntie, uncle, regardless of their age. This set of rules and behavior resulted from the long history of racial discrimination in the United States. Racism was most evident in the South, but extended throughout American society. Segregation in public accommodations. Segregation was commonplace in public places, especially in the South. The practice was notably strengthened by the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, when the court ruled that railroad cars could be segregated if the accommodations were separate but equal. This doctrine enabled state lawmakers to legally segregate public accommodations, including theaters, restaurants, libraries, parks, and transportation. Jim Crow laws established separate facilities for whites and blacks across the South. Blacks and whites were separated in waiting rooms and restrooms, train cars and buses, theaters and restaurants, on open park benches. One state even passed a law requiring segregated telephone booths. Often there were no accommodations for blacks. Some restaurants refused to serve African Americans, while certain facilities had a bathroom for whites but not blacks. Other times, the facility for blacks was notably inferior. This was often the case in schools. In the above photo, a young man drinks from a water fountain designated for African Americans. Segregated facilities were commonplace in the South during the post-war era. Both blacks and white citizens strictly followed segregation rules. Segregation in schools. Jim Crow laws began to affect schools shortly after the Civil War. By 1888, school segregation had been established in almost every southern state, including some northern and western states as well. The Plessy decision mandated that separate racial accommodations be equal, but they were often not. Southern states allocated far more funding for white schools than black schools, so the latter often lacked books, supplies, and adequate facilities. In some black schools, students had to gather firewood to heat their classrooms in the winter. Teachers in black schools worked in more difficult conditions for lower salaries. White schools often had bus systems, while black students often walked for miles to school. Segregation in housing. African Americans also experienced two forms of housing segregation. One was de facto segregation, which was established in practice and custom. The second was de jure segregation, or segregation by law. While de facto segregation occurred throughout the country, de jure segregation was largely concentrated in the South. De facto segregation was common in most northern cities. When large numbers of African Americans began moving north in the 1900s, many white residents employed unofficial measures to prevent blacks from settling in their neighborhoods. One practice was to create a restrictive covenant, or an agreement among neighbors not to sell or rent to African Americans or other racial minorities. Restrictive covenants also often forced blacks into poor neighborhoods, farther from jobs, public transport, or good schools. De jure segregation was accomplished through racial zoning, or local laws that defined where races could live. The federal government supported racial zoning in the 1930s and 1940s until the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. In 1951, even so, segregated neighborhoods remained common in many southern cities. Segregation in marriage. Between 1870 and 1884, 11 southern states passed laws prohibiting miscegenation or interracial marriage. According to one historian, these were the ultimate segregation laws, as they stated both that blacks were inferior to whites and that any racial mixing through marriage or childbirth threatened the purity of the white race, end quote. Some states outside the South also banned interracial marriage. Many of these miscegenation laws not only outlawed marriage between African Americans and whites, but also between whites and Asians, as well as whites and American Indians. Segregation in the workplace. Employment and working conditions reflected the thorough segregation of American society. Few blacks held white-collar jobs, positions that do not involve manual labor. Those who did were often teachers or ministers. Furthermore, few blacks were employed as skilled laborers, most working instead in either agriculture or service. Their wages were considerably lower than those of whites. In 1940, for example, the median income level of black men was less than half that of white men. Employment discrimination was a direct result of racism as well as insufficient African American schooling. Illiteracy and a lack of education helped trap blacks in low-level jobs, especially in the South. From the end of the Civil War through the 1940s, various states passed laws imposing segregation in public schools and other facilities. Although these laws were most common in the Jim Crow South, some northern and western states implemented segregation as well. Here are the states with segregation laws during this period, categorized by the forms of segregation they enforced. Education, public accommodation, both. Enactment of interracial marriage laws. Over half the states were banned interracial marriage laws in the 1940s. In 1967, Supreme Court ruled in Loving versus Virginia, laws against mixed marriage were unconstitutional. Alabama was the last state to repeal its interracial marriage law. Segregation in politics. Southern whites also found ways to disenfranchise or deny voting rights to African Americans. In the years following Reconstruction, poll taxes and literacy tests prevented many blacks from voting. Many southern states also disenfranchised blacks through the white primary, a primary election in which only whites could participate. This primary was used to support the Democratic Party's domination in southern politics, which southern whites believed opposed radical Reconstruction and civil rights. Democrats excluded blacks from party membership, thus denying them the right to vote in party primaries. As a result, the Democrats did not have to attract black voters, and blacks had no political representation. The white primary was practiced extensively in Texas between 1923 and 1944. Texas Democrats used it to limit black political participation. However, the Supreme Court declared white primaries unconstitutional in 1944. So more African Americans began voting in Texas, and the number of registered black voters rose substantially. Gerrymandering, or the practice of redrawing the lines of a voting district to give one party or group of voters an advantage, was also used to discriminate against black voters, rendering the votes meaningless. If the majority of voters in a voting district are African American, they may be able to elect candidates who represent their interests. However, if the voting district lines are gerrymandered to separate the African American population into white majority districts, the black vote becomes diluted and less effective. Through gerrymandering, black voters were often denied political power. These political methods differed from the violent means used in the early years after Reconstruction, when blacks were sometimes forcibly prevented from voting. Yet they were equally effective in denying blacks the voting rights and limiting black representation in government. Small steps towards equality. Section 2. In 1944, Jackie Robinson, who would become one of the greatest baseball players in the history of the game, was an Army lieutenant stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. Leaving the base one day, he boarded a military bus and took a seat in front. When the driver ordered him to move to the back, Robinson refused and was arrested once he exited the bus. Nearly court-martialed for his actions that day, Robinson would later achieve fame on the baseball diamond and become a role model for millions of Americans. Over the course of his life, Robinson came to represent the struggles of African Americans to advance in white-dominated society. Breaking the color line in sports. Jackie Robinson began his baseball career in the Negro Leagues after World War II. At this time, the sport was divided by the color line, a barrier created by custom law and economic differences to separate whites from non-whites. Robinson crossed the color line when Brooklyn Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey signed him in 1945. After briefly playing for the minor league team, Robinson took the field in a Dodgers uniform in 1947. Being the first black Major League Baseball player was difficult. Fans taunted him. Some of his own teammates resented him playing with him, and players on opposing teams tried to bean him with the ball or spike him with their cleats. As he later recalled, plenty of times I wanted to haul off and fight when someone insulted me of my color of my skin, but I had to hold to myself. I knew I was kind of an experiment. The whole thing was bigger than me. Robinson eventually overcame these obstacles, leading his team to 6 league championships and 1 World Series victory. Meanwhile, other professional sports began to accept black athletes. Football became integrated when 4 black players joined the professional league in 1946. 4 years later, the National Basketball Association admitted its first African-American players. By the 1950s, the color line in professional sports was gradually disappearing. Desegregation of the armed forces. The color line would soon dissolve in the armed forces as well, but again, change did not come easily. Despite the valuable contributions of African Americans, soldiers during the war, during World War II, the military remained segregated after the war. Many GIs returned from combat to face continued segregation at home, especially in the Jim Crow South. In 1946, Army veteran Isaac Woodard was traveling by bus from North Carolina to Georgia. At one stop, the driver threatened Woodard for spending too much time in the colored bathroom. In their ensuing argument, Woodard was arrested before police officers beat him so badly that he was permanently blinded. When President Truman learned of the incident, he was appalled and vowed to change segregation in the military. "I shall never approve of it," he wrote. "I am going to try to remedy it." Truman knew desegregation in the armed forces was necessary, both on moral grounds and for political reasons. Like many Americans, he recognized that it was hypocritical to fight Nazism and anti-Semitism abroad while maintaining a color line at home. He also worried that U.S. segregation could undermine efforts to promote freedom and democracy overseas in the Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. As the Cold War intensified in the late 1940s, political leaders discussed the need to rebuild the armed forces. Many African Americans said they would refuse to fight in a segregated army. So although a significant number of armed forces leaders opposed desegregation, Truman believed that military discrimination must end. On July 26, 1948, Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which stated, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." With this order, the armed forces were officially commanded to desegregate. Civil rights organizations challenged discrimination. The battle for desegregation would not have succeeded without the determined efforts of civil rights activists. Many Americans worked tirelessly in the various organizations dedicated to achieving equal rights. One of these organizations was the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, founded in 1942 by a group of students in Chicago. CORE was committed to effecting change, though through nonviolent direct action. Its first operation, staging a peaceful protest at a segregated coffee shop in Chicago in 1943, garnered national attention, helping CORE to spread to other northern cities. CORE assisted the desegregation of many public facilities in the North before shifting its attention to the South in the late 1950s. Another key civil rights group, the National Urban League, formed in response to the Great Migration of blacks to northern cities in the early 1900s. The Urban League worked to help African Americans achieve success in the North by counseling newly arrived migrants and training black social workers. The group also promoted educational and employment opportunities for African Americans. During World War II, the Urban League helped integrate defense plants. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the oldest major civil rights organization, remained active in the struggle for equal rights. Founded in 1909, the NAACP continued its efforts to promote civil rights legislation. In 1939, the group established a legal branch for civil rights action called the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. The following year, Thurgood Marshall became the head of this group. The Legal Defense Fund and Educational Fund was dedicated to defeating segregation through the court system. Its main weapon was Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying any person equal protection of the law. Since the clause prohibits discrimination by states, it is crucial to the protection of civil rights. Thurgood Marshall, head of the NAACP's legal defense branch, was denied admission to the University of Maryland because he was not white. He eventually earned a law degree from Howard University, one of Marshall's first legal victories. He sued the University of Maryland over its race policy. Marshall later served on the Supreme Court. The courts began to dismantle segregation. Getting to school was a challenge for 7-year-old Linda Brown from Topeka, Kansas in 1951. She had to walk a mile to the bus stop, passing through a railroad yard on the way. Then she endured the long bus ride to school. The trip seemed bizarre to her. There was a good school located merely 7 blocks away from her house. The schools of Topeka were segregated, however, so Linda, a black girl, was unable to attend the whites-only school nearest to her. Eventually, her father, Oliver Brown, decided to protest through the court system. Brown and other civil rights activists gradually began to dismantle segregation. Early court decisions make big strides. The Supreme Court began to strike down Jim Crow laws in the 1930s and 1940s. The court ordered the University of Maryland to admit a black student in 1935, later declared white primaries unconstitutional, and also barred segregation and interstate transport. These were critical steps toward ending segregation in the United States. In 1948, the Supreme Court confronted segregated housing in Shelley v. Kramer, ruling that states could not enforce restrictive covenants. As a result, many city neighborhoods became desegregated. For example, over the next few years, thousands of black families in Chicago moved to areas that had previously been restricted to whites. In 1950, the court issued strong rulings against educational discrimination. In 2 cases, the court declared that segregation in graduate school and law school was unconstitutional. It seemed as though separate but equal education was dissolving. We got McLaren v. Oklahoma State Regents for Higher Education, Norman, Oklahoma, 1950. McLaren sued for admission at University of Oklahoma, but was told he must sit in a designated row of chairs and study at a certain table in the library. The court demanded that McLaren receive the same treatment as students of other races while attending the state-supported school. Sweat versus Painter, Houston, Texas, 1950. University of Texas Law School rejected Heman Sweat because of his race. The court held that the educational opportunities offered to white and black law students by Texas were unequal and required that Sweat be admitted. Mills versus the Board of Education of Anne and Ardrell County and Ardrell County, Maryland, 1939. Walter Mills, a black school teacher, sued the Board of Education over salaries, citing the minimum and annual salaries as $1,250 for white teachers and $765 for black teachers. The court ordered that the salary discrimination based on race be stopped, but refused to order the school board to order the school board to pay black teachers less than white teachers. Not to pay black teachers less than white teachers. Missouri, Gaines versus Canada, Columbia, Missouri, 1938. Lloyd Gaines was denied admission to the University of Missouri, all-white law school. The court held that Missouri had no in-state higher education for black citizens that compared to that of white citizens. The state responded by developing a black law school within the University of Missouri. A landmark ruling, Brown versus Board of Education. In Topeka, Oliver Brown had contacted the NAACP, which in turn gathered 12 other parents to join efforts to desegregate the city's schools. These parents first attempted to enroll their children in white schools but were denied admission. So the NAACP sued the Topeka School District in court in 1951. When a local court found no willful discrimination, the NAACP appealed the case, advancing all the way to the Supreme Court. Brown versus Board of Education was comprised of a set of multiple court cases from Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. that were moving through the court system concurrently. The Supreme Court decided to combine the cases into one because the plaintiffs were all aiming for the same legal outcome. The Brown case was a class action lawsuit, or lawsuits filed by people on behalf of themselves and a larger group who might also benefit from the case's outcome. The NAACP's lead attorney, Thurgood Marshall, argued the case supplying evidence to demonstrate how segregation harms African American children. The most famous piece of evidence, called the doll test, was the doll test. In this experiment, 16 black school children were shown a white doll and a brown doll. 10 of the children chose the white doll as the nice doll, while 11 children selected the black doll as the one that looked bad. According to the psychologist who conducted the test, the Negro child accepts as early as 6 or 7 or 8 the negative stereotypes about his own group. The Brown case circled the Supreme Court for a year and a half. During this time, a new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, was appointed to the Supreme Court. Warren was a firm opponent of segregation, believing that a unanimous decision in the Brown case would carry more weight than a divided one. He worked to convince every judge to rule in favor of the plaintiffs. He finally succeeded in May of 1954 and announced the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education on May 17th. We come then to this question presented: does segregation of children in public schools solely based on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and the tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe that it does. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated for whom the actions have been brought are, by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Brown versus Board of Education. The Brown decision dismantled the legal basis for segregation in schools and other public places. For this reason, the outcome of the Supreme Court case was one of the most important judicial decisions in the nation's history, and it was one of the many landmark civil rights rulings under Earl Warren, who served as Chief Justice of the Court from 1953 to 1969. As demonstrated by the Brown decision, the Warren Court became known for its activism on civil rights and free speech. All deliberate speed, ? Much of the South resists change. A year after the Brown decision, the Supreme Court issued a second ruling known as Brown 2, which instructed states to begin desegregation with all deliberate speed. The phrase was chosen carefully as the justices wanted desegregation to be implemented rapidly, but recognized that many obstacles stood in the way. Therefore, Brown 2 gave states some flexibility to desegregate their schools in accordance with Brown. Desegregation occurred without incident in some border states, but there was greater resistance in parts of the South. For example, in Mississippi, a white citizens' council published a handbook called Black Monday in 1955, referring to the day the Supreme Court announced the Brown decision. Their handbook called for an end to the NAACP and public schools and advocated a separate state for African Americans. Despite opposition, the Brown decision inspired hope that African Americans could achieve equal rights in American society. It also served as a catalyst for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, when many individuals and groups dedicated themselves to promoting equality, opportunity, and rights. Progress towards school desegregation was slow in the first 10 years after the Brown ruling. After 1964, however, the pace of desegregation quickened. By 1976, school populations in majority white schools in the South were nearly 40% black. Segregation remained widespread in the United States after World War II, especially in the South. But there were also signs of change. In the 1940s and 1950s, desegregation began in sports and the military. Civil rights organizations grew stronger. The landmark Supreme Court ruling Brown versus Board of Education heralded the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. Segregated societies, breaking the color line, Executive Order 9981, integrated the military, civil rights groups, Brown versus Board of Education. In this integrated classroom, Washington, D.C., blacks and white students sit side by side. In 1957, the Supreme Court's landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision decreed segregation unconstitutional. Desegregation was not implemented without resistance, however, especially in the South.